I'll do my best to talk you through our report, our analysis, the data we analysed, touch on some of the findings, and really just try and tease the report so that it's available online. So if you want to read it after I'm done, or maybe you already have, then feel free to access it there. And before I get started, just thanks everyone for tuning in. So I'm going to start with my personal favourite part of any presentation, which is talking about the methodology. You might not agree with me, but I really like when I listen to people talking about their work, hearing about what they looked at, why they looked at it, and so that, gives you more context to what's going on. So what we did in this paper is we looked at 17 years worth of court data, so data from Queensland courts. Our data period started in 2005 and goes up to 2021-22. So that on the screen is the 17 years that we looked at. And we looked at children who committed offences while under the age of 14. So it doesn't matter how old they were when they were sentenced by a court. What matters is how old they were when they committed an offence. Now, as John discussed previously, there's two current proposals floating around for raising the minimum age. One is to raise the age to 12, and the other is to raise the age to 14. So throughout this report and throughout this presentation, I'll be presenting those two cohorts separately and talking about them separately. So the very first thing we did when we got started is we wanted to know how many are there? How many children are there under the age of 14 that are committing offences? So to put it into context, I've got a big bubble on the screen that represents all sentence cases in Queensland. This is children, this is adults, this is everyone. So over the 17 years, I think it was about 2.5 million sentenced cases. If you just look at children, so this is all children under the age of 18. They represent about 7.4% of sentence cases. But what we were interested in was the very young children. So that's these ones here that were under the age of 14. So there's age 10, 11, 12, and 13. So that's 0.7% of cases. And this is what I'm going to focus on today and what we focused on in our report. Now, before I get into those young kids, though, I just want to take a moment to talk about children generally. So if this is all children under the age of 18 who have been sentenced in the past 17 years, the 12 and 13-year-olds represent the bulk of the cohort we're looking at today, so 8.3%. And that tiny little slither of purple that you can probably barely see down the bottom is the 10 and 11-year-olds, who represent 1.1% of children. So we're talking about, like, if I just go back a bit, we're talking about 0.7% of all sentence cases. But if we just look at children, we're talking about 10% of children who are sentenced. And most of them are the older age bracket. So these are the official numbers we published in our paper. So over the 17 years, there are about 7,200 unique children in this cohort. And if you divide that by 17, you get a yearly average of about 650 unique children being sentenced in Queensland each year. For the younger children, there's a lot fewer of them. There's about 1,100, a little less than that, over the full period, which is about 87 per year on average. Now, in our report, we've also reported quite a bit on court cases as well as unique children, and I'll touch on that a bit throughout the presentation today as well. And I won't go into too much detail, but I will just say that the number of court cases is a lot higher than the number of unique children. And that's because about 50% of these kids in this cohort are repeat offenders. They come before the courts more than once. And so the number of court cases is higher than the number of unique children. So this here is looking at the 17 years of data over time. The purple bar across the bottom is the very young kids, the 10 and 11-year-olds. And just generally what this is showing is that things tended to trend upwards from about 2005 through to about 2017-18. Then pandemic hit, the number of cases sentenced, committed, detected dropped. But interestingly, the numbers haven't seemed to have come back up since that pandemic hit. So they've stayed low since 2019-20. Now, I've spoken a lot about the age of kids, and this is going to be the last slide looking at ages, I promise, maybe. But really what I wanted to show here is that the 10-year-olds, there's so few of them. In fact, you can barely see them on this chart. In fact, can you? Maybe if you get a magnifying glass. But this chart shows the number of cases that were sentenced based on the age of the person being sentenced. Shows everyone, of course, children and adults. Whoops, wrong way. These ones that I've just highlighted are the ones that we're focusing on our report. And if I just zoom into that, this is the breakdown. So 10-year-olds make up 2.8% of this small cohort, whereas most of the cases that were sentenced were for 13-year-olds. So about 2/3 of all the cases that I'm going to show you today were 13-year-olds. About another quarter were 12-year-olds, and then about 10-13% were the very young children. Okay, now to get into some demographics. So this chart breaks it down by gender and Indigenous status. And this is where I'm going to start separating out the under 14s on the left and the under 12s on the right. But if you look at the under 14s for now, about almost 3/4, so about 73% were boys. And slightly more than half were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So this is clearly a disproportionate number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children being sentenced. For this cohort, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children make up about 7.9% of all children aged under 14, well, 10 to 13. But they're making up more than 50% of sentence cases for this cohort. For the under 12s, it's a lot higher. It's almost 3/4 of children are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So on this chart, it's if you add up both the boys and the girls. So another thing, while we're looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status, we also obtained some data from the QPS, from the Queensland Police Service, looking at police diversions. So we asked for data on children under the age of 14 who are being diverted by police, so the ones that weren't proceeded against in court. And just looking at the latest financial year, 2021-22, we found that just over 40% of the cohort diverted by police were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Whereas if we compare this to the percentage of children that were sentenced in a court, it was much higher at 61.8%. So this is consistent with previous research that's been conducted in New South Wales by Don Weatherburn and Brendan Thomas. They published a paper a couple of months ago, earlier this year, which showed that when they controlled for a bunch of factors like seriousness of offence and other things, and they found that there was a greater percentage of Indigenous children aged 10, 11, 12, 13 that were being prosecuted rather than diverted by police. And so our slides sort of perhaps show something similar. Now, before we move on from demographics, I'm just going to quickly touch on some trends over time. So this chart here, the top two lines, the solid lines that aren't broken, are looking at boys. So the top one's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander boys, and the second one's non-Indigenous boys. And over the 17 years, you can see that the proportion of boys has been decreasing. If you look at the dotted lines now, which is the girls, you can see over the same period, the proportion of girls has increased, particularly for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander girls, where it was, they represent about 11% of sentence cases back in 2005-06, but it's almost doubled to 21% in 2021-22. Now, I'm going to talk about the types of offences that were committed. Now, the way we've split our data here is based on the ANZSOC classification, which is the Australian and New Zealand Standard Offence Classification that the ABS put together and publish. And what this is it's a grouping, it's a classification of different offences. So in Queensland, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different offences. And what we've done here is we've grouped them up into some categories that make sense, so that we can know, so we can display 15 categories rather than hundreds of offences. And what we see here is for the children under 14, the most common categories of offences were theft, unlawful entry, and property and environment. So the theft offences involve most commonly the offence of stealing, but also unlawful use of a motor vehicle, which you could think of as car theft, but all the lawyers online might say, no, not quite. And then also shoplifting is one of the common offences in that theft category, or unlawfully dealing with shop goods, I think it's called. The second category is unlawful entry, which includes both burglary of a home as well as the unlawful entry of a non-home premises, so maybe a shop or a warehouse or something else. And then finally, property environment. There's no environmental offences here. It's mostly property and it's mostly willful damage. And I suspect a lot of those offences are graffiti-related offences as well. So now comparing that to all children, all adults, everyone who's sentenced in Queensland, you can see that the offence profiles are quite different. Adults are more commonly being sentenced for traffic and vehicle offences as the most common one, followed by justice and government offences, and that includes things like breach of bail or breach of domestic violence order most commonly. And drugs, of course, are quite common for adults, but not so common for children under the age of 14. So as I mentioned before, this slide looks at very broad categories of offences. On the next couple of slides, I'm going to drill down to specific individual offences in Queensland. So this is the top 5 offences that were committed by each cohort. And you can probably tell that they're quite similar. So the most common offence for each was unlawful entry. And this is unlawful entry. It's not burglary, it's unlawful entry of something that isn't a home where people don't live. The other common offences are willful damage, damaging property, stealing, and trespass. And so they're all property-related offences, I guess. It's not assaults or offences against the person. It's offences against property. And then the distinguishing factor, I guess, is the 5th offence, which for children under 14 is unlawful use of motor vehicles, whereas for children under 12, it's burglary, which is breaking into a place where people live, a home or a dwelling. Now, before I move on, the majority of these cases that I've been talking about are sentenced in the lower courts. In fact, I think it's 94.5%. So about 95% of all the cases I'm talking about here are the lesser serious cases dealt with in the lower courts. So out of the 19,000 odd cases sentenced over the 17 years, only 919 were sentenced in the higher courts. And by higher courts, I mean either the Supreme Court or the District Court. Well, the Children's Court for this cohort. So I'm now going to show you the top 5 offences that were sentenced in the higher courts. So bear in mind, this is only about 5% of offences, but it is the 5% of offences that are being sentenced in the more serious courts. And this is what it looks like. So there's a bit of a difference between the two cohorts this time. The most common offence for each is still robbery. So it's the same for both. But the other ones are a bit different. So for the under 14s, you can see there we've got AOBH, indecent treatment, rape, and attempted robbery. And for the children under 12, it's a bit different. Some of the same offences in a different order: indecent treatment, attempted robbery, rape, and arson. So I guess the point we're trying to make here is, although the majority of cases, 95%, are these low serious ones dealt with in the lower courts, there are still some serious offences being committed by this cohort. Some offences that are against the person now rather than against property, but it is a small volume of children. And since it is a small volume, we can probably target resources, programs, interventions, other things towards this cohort. And to just put it in context, if we look at robbery as an example, that's the most common offence sentenced here in the higher courts for these cohorts. If we put in context of all cases sentenced, so all robbery cases, including adults, children of all ages, the robberies committed by this cohort represent about 3%. And just looking at my notes here, it's about 3.4% of robbery cases are committed by these young kids. So not insignificant, but not large either. Now sentencing outcomes. So we are a sentencing outcome. So it makes sense, of course, that we have a look at sentencing outcomes. Often we often run into the situation where we spend a lot of our time talking about the cohort and the numbers and the offences and everything else, and we sort of get to sentencing outcomes at the end. But it is important to put it all into context before we get to this point. So again, I've got the children under 14 on the left and the children under 12 on the right. The most common offence for both cohorts was a reprimand, as you can see down towards the bottom there. And then it was the same order. The top 4 or 5 offences were the same for each. So reprimand was the most common, followed by probation orders, followed by court diversion referrals, good behaviour bonds, and then finally community service. So those under 12, it's quite a similar distribution. There are a few differences. Like, for example, if you have a look at detention at the top there, there's many more detention orders for the children under 14 compared to the children under 12. I personally don't like using a chart like this to compare one to the other because it's a bit hard to see. So I've got this chart, which shows the exact same information, just presented a bit differently. So we've got the children, again, children under 14 on the right, on the left, children under 12 on the right. And you can see that reprimand and probation are much more common for children under 12 compared to children under 14. Court diversion referrals and good behaviour bonds, which were the third and fourth most common penalty, didn't really change too much, whereas there's a huge difference in community service. So the younger children didn't get many community service orders at all, and that's mostly because community service orders can't actually be made for these younger children. So the very small number of children there that did get a community service order, it's probably because they committed an offence while they were under 12, but they weren't sentenced until later. And so because they were sentenced when they're older, a community service order was able to be made. And then finally, we've got detention there, and you can see that detention orders go from 2.1% for the children under 14 down to 0.5% for the children under 12. So it's 4 times more likely for the older kids. And in fact, if you look at the 10-year-olds, there were no detention orders whatsoever for that cohort. Okay, so now I've done a sort of bit of a mix and match. So we're now looking at the top 3 most common offences. So you might remember from just before, I said the top 3 offences were unlawful entry of a premises, willful damage, and stealing. And now we're looking at these top 3 offences and looking what the sentencing outcomes were for those offences. So for unlawful entry, most of those children got a probation order. So a bit more than a quarter of the cases were probation for an average length of 7.4 months, or a median of about 6 months. Willful damage most commonly got a community service order in about a third of cases. Now, this is sort of a special case because if the children, if the damage they caused was graffiti, then the courts can or perhaps must order a graffiti removal order. So you can see that 64% of these community service orders were actually graffiti removal orders. So they're orders to go and remove graffiti. So you can, this is what I alluded to before when I said that I suspect most of these willful damage sentences were graffiti, because that's what they were. And then finally, we've got stealing as the third most common offence, and most commonly the offenders were reprimanded. So the children were reprimanded for this offence. Now, this is my last slide, and we're talking about the most serious sentences that were handed down. So we're looking at detention orders over time. So a couple of slides before, we saw that 2.1% of orders were detention orders. And what the line chart here shows is the proportion of detention orders and how they've changed over time. So over the 17 years, it was 2.1%, but you can see there was actually a lot of fluctuation. So in 2011-12, for example, it was as low as 1.1%. And in other years, it was more than 3% of orders were detention orders. The bars there just simply show the number of detention orders that were made. So overall, over the 17 years, there were 379 detention orders. You can see that that ranges from some years being as low as 10 or so, especially in recent years, to other years where there were more than 30 orders made in a year. On average, the length of a detention order was about 5 months. But the types of offences that attracted detention order was most commonly burglary, so breaking into someone's home. So I think about a quarter, about 1 in 4 of the detention orders were for burglary. Now, I mentioned this briefly a second ago, but the majority of these detention orders were for children aged 13, so the older kids. 80%, in fact, were 80% of detention orders were for 13-year-olds. Well, not quite 80%, 78.4%. There were no 10-year-olds that got detention orders, and if you look at 11-year-olds, only 3% of the detention orders were for those aged 11. So some were given for 12-year-olds, but most were given to 13-year-olds. We also in our paper looked a bit at repeat offending, and what we found was for the children who received detention, they all had, well, 94%, most of them had prior sentenced cases. So 94% of the detention orders, those children had been to court before, had been sentenced before. We had a look at the 6% that had never been to court before, and those first-time offenders that received detention had committed quite serious offences, including things like rape, grievous bodily harm, arson, burglary, robbery, and torture. We also had a look at repeat offending for kids that got a detention order, and we found and we found that 3/4 of children that were sentenced to detention only received that one detention order while they were in this cohort. So they didn't get multiple detention orders under the age of 14. So it was only about a quarter of kids that did get, so a quarter of the kids that got detention a second time while under this age. So thanks so much for sticking around with me, everyone. I'm going to hand